So we have here two quadratics, and I want to introduce this idea of what's known as a parabola. So if we have a look at these two quadratics, so we have this quadratic here. So for example, x squared minus 3x plus 2 is equal to y. Okay, so this is a quadratic, and if we graph this out, let's say like so, and if we were to get the factors, so for example the factors are x minus 2 multiplied by x minus 1, and then if we were to get to roots, we notice that the roots are, for example, if we look at this parabola here, so it's this curve, for example, it's a graph, where the parabola cuts the x-axis, where y is equal to 0, these are the roots for the quadratic. And quadratics will form this parabola, and you will be able to figure out what the roots are for the quadratic by looking at where the line, for example, in the parabola cuts the x-axis. So if we were to look at, let's say this particular one here, okay, so this quadratic here. So the quadratic, like we could just write out the quadratic just like this. So the quadratic would be x squared minus 3x plus 2 and is equal to 0. Okay, so we could as easily write it like that. Okay, now instead of having 0, we have this, we can think about it like a function. Okay, so we have this y value. So another way to kind of think about it is we can call it, for example, function x, or we can call it y. And basically what that means is that if we have a graph, for example, on a graph, we have this axis here, which is the x-axis, and then we have this axis here, which is the y-axis. And a quadratic like this, for example, can be used to describe a particular graph, or it can be used to describe the relationship between y and x. So in order to figure out what the value for y is, we can put in the value into this expression, and it'll give us out the value for y. And then what we can do is we can plot this on a graph that looks something like this. And generally quadratics, when you plot them on a graph, they will look like this. So okay, so they'll have this particular shape. And then if we get the roots, so we can factorize it, so the way we've been factorizing, for example, and we can end up with the factors. So for example, the factors for this quadratic would be x minus 1 multiplied by x minus 2. So these are the factors for this particular quadratic. And then if we get the roots, so for example, we can say x, so this is equal to 0. So then x minus 1 is equal to 0. And then we can get the root by adding 1 here, adding 1 here, and then x is equal to plus 1. And then the same we can do for this one here. So x minus 2 is equal to 0. And we can add 2 here, add 2 here, and then we have x is equal to 2. Okay, so these two here values are the root for this quadratic. Now, another way to think about it is we can see here that on the parabola, so where this parabola cuts the x-axis at these 2 points, these are the roots that we've worked out here. So another way to think about it is when the value of y is equal to 0, what's the value for x? So for example, and you can use that on the graph, so you can say here, for example, is where it's going to be equal to 0, y is equal to 0, and if we go across, we can see that this is the first value of x when y is 0, and then this is the second value of x when y is 0. Or these are, in other words, known as what's called the roots for the parabola, or the roots for the particular quadratic. So that's just it's just a quick introduction that, you know, quadratics, you can graph a quadratic equation. It looks something like this. And this is what's called a parabola. And if you're given a graph like this and you're asked to find out what's the roots for the particular quadratic, the roots are where the quadratic cuts the cuts the x-axis. The same with this one here. Okay, so this is a quadratic here, x squared plus y plus 3x minus 2. These are the factors for this particular quadratic, and then if we wanted to work out, for example, what are the roots, we could say x minus 1 is equal to 0, so therefore we add 1 here, and then x is equal to 1. Okay, so that's the first one from here, and then the second one will be x minus 2 is equal to 0, and then we can add 2 here and add 2 here, and that's going to be equal to, so they'll cancel out and it'll be x is equal to 2. Okay, so these are the two roots, so this one and this one, and we can see that if we take this parabola here, so this is the particular shape for this particular parabola, we can see that here is where it cuts the x-axis, okay, when y is equal to 0, and we see that the roots are 1 and 2, just like what we worked out there. So this is just a quick introduction to quadratics and this idea of what's known as a parabola, and how you can use a parabola or this graph to identify what the roots are. The roots are always going to be where the parabola cuts the x-axis, where y is equal to 0.